The organ pipes trembled with a sound so low it felt like a judgment from the earth itself. Light, thick and colored as honey, streamed through the stained glass saints, painting stripes of ruby and sapphire across the cold stone floor of the Denver Cathedral. But for Clara, standing at the altar, there was no light. There was only the suffocating scent of 1,000 white lilies and the bird-bone grip of the man beside her. Emery Vane. His name was a hammer blow, a name chiseled onto rail cars and bank buildings, a name that owned men and mountains. He was 55, maybe 60, a landscape of a man, all harsh lines and weathered skin, with eyes like chips of winter ice. The hand that held hers was a thing of dry parchment and thick, ropey veins, a hand that had signed contracts and ruined lives. It felt like a trap, and her own fingers, limp and cold within it, were the bait. Her wedding dress, a Parisian confection of lace and satin that had cost more than a decent horse and saddle, felt like a shroud. The corset bit into her ribs, a cruel cage for her hammering heart. The preacher's voice was a distant drone, a river of words she could not follow. He spoke of union, of devotion, of God's holy light. Clara saw only a long, dark tunnel stretching into years of silent dinners, of his dry, reptilian touch in the night, of a life that was no life at all. She was 19, and to love and to cherish, in sickness and in health. Her breath hitched, a tremor started in her knees, a violent shudder that threatened to topple her. Vane's grip tightened, his knuckles pressing into her bones. A silent warning. He had bought her. A simple transaction between her father's failing investments and Vane's ever-expanding empire. She was another asset, another gleaming acquisition to be displayed. The preacher paused, his benevolent gaze resting on her. "Do you, Clara May, take this man?" Her gaze lifted, sliding past Vane's stony profile, past the rows of Denver's finest society, their face smug and placid. It found the great oak doors at the back of the church, the doors that led to the world, a world where she might be poor, where she might be lost, but where she would be her own. It was a choice between two kinds of death, a slow one in a gilded cage, or a fast one in the wild. A single, choked gasp escaped her lips. That was all. She tore her hand from Vane's grip with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The lilies in her bouquet scattered across the marble like fallen soldiers. For a frozen second, the whole cathedral held its breath. Then, she turned and ran. She ran from the altar, her satin slippers skidding on the polished stone. A collective gasp rippled through the pews. Vane's face, when she risked a glance back, was a mask of thunderous disbelief, his mouth a thin, white line of fury. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. He simply made a sharp, almost imperceptible gesture with his head. Two men, broad-shouldered and grim in their dark suits, detached themselves from the front pew and started after her. She didn't run for the main doors. She knew they would be on her before she reached the street. Instead, she ducked behind a pillar and pushed through a small, heavy door she remembered from the rehearsal. It led to a sacristy that smelled of old wine and beeswax. She fumbled with the iron bolt on the back door, her fingers slick with sweat. It groaned open into a narrow, cobbled alleyway, and into the rain. A cold, hard Denver downpour was turning the city gray. The shock of it stole her breath. It plastered the fine lace of her dress to her skin, soaking her hair in seconds. The alley was a river of mud and filth. Her satin slippers were useless, and she kicked them off, the delicate silk instantly swallowed by the muck. The rain was a baptism. It washed the scent of lilies and Emery Vane from her skin. A shout echoed from the church. They were coming. She ran, her bare feet finding purchase on the slick, uneven stones. The hem of her magnificent dress dragged in the mud, growing heavy, pulling at her like a hand from the grave. She reached the end of the alley and tore at the delicate buttons on the bodice. It was no use. With a cry of frustration, she gathered the sodden material and ripped it, tearing away the long, cumbersome train. She was on a wider street now, horses shying away from the wild-eyed woman in a ruined white dress. She didn't stop. She saw the veil, still pinned in her hair, catch on a low-hanging branch. She ripped it free and let the wind take it, a white ghost swirling away into the gray afternoon. She was shedding a skin, piece by painful piece. The rail yard was a sprawling, chaotic city of iron and steam. The hiss of engines and the clang of hammers filled the air, a symphony of industry that drowned out the pounding of her own heart. The shouts of her pursuers were lost in the noise. Smoke and rain hung thick in the air. She slipped between cars, her breath coming in ragged sobs, her lungs burning. She saw them then, Vane's men, fanning out at the edge of the yard, their dark coats stark against the mist. They were methodical. They would find her. Panic gave way to a desperate, animal cunning. She saw a long freight train, its engine idling, steam pluming from its stack. An open boxcar door offered a dark rectangle of hope. With the last of her strength, she scrambled up, her bare feet slipping on the wet iron, her fingers raw. She tumbled inside, landing hard on the rough wooden floor. She crawled deeper into the darkness, pulling a stiff, greasy tarp over her body. She burrowed between crates that smelled of canvas, dry goods, and the sharp, sweet tang of whiskey. She lay there, trembling in the dark, her ruined dress clinging to her like a cold second skin, and listened to the rain hammer on the roof of the car. The train gave a violent jolt, then another. With a great groaning of metal and a percussive hiss of steam, it began to move. It was heading west. Clara closed her eyes and surrendered to the motion. A piece of driftwood on an iron river, carried away from everything she had ever known. For 2 days and 3 nights, the train was her world. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track was the only clock she kept. Hunger arrived first, a dull ache that sharpened into a gnawing cramp. Thirst was worse, a dry, rasping fire in her throat. She licked the condensation from the inside of the boxcar's wall, the metallic taste doing little to quench the fire. Through a crack in the wooden slats, she watched the world unspool. The green rolling hills outside Denver flattened into an endless sea of brown grass that stretched to a horizon so wide it seemed to bend. The sky was immense, a pale, washed-out blue that offered no shade, no comfort. The train cut through barren, sun-scorched hills and across desolate plains, where the only signs of life were the heat shimmering off the ground and the occasional lonely hawk circling in the vast emptiness. She was no longer Clara May, the debutante, the bride. That girl had died in the Denver Cathedral. This new creature was a survivor, huddled in the dark, her senses pared down to the essentials, the rumble in her belly, the burn in her throat, the constant, bone-jarring motion of the train. She slept in fits and starts, waking to the cold that seeped through the floorboards at night, her dreams filled with the image of Vane's icy eyes. On the 3rd day, the train slowed, its rhythmic clatter giving way to a long, agonized squeal of brakes. It stopped with a final, shuddering jolt that sent a crate of whiskey crashing against the wall. A bottle broke, and the sharp, alcoholic scent filled the car. For a long time, there was only silence, broken by the ticking of the cooling engine and the whisper of the wind outside. This wasn't a station. There was no platform, no town visible through the crack, just the same endless expanse of brown earth and bleached sky. Clara waited, her body coiled like a spring. Hours passed. The sun beat down on the metal roof, turning the boxcar into an oven. Finally, convinced the train was abandoned for now, she pushed aside the tarp and crawled to the door. The light was blinding. She squinted, her hand shielding her eyes. The train had stopped on a lonely stretch of track, a mile or more from a small cluster of buildings shimmering in the heat haze. It was a town, of a sort. She lowered herself to the ground, her legs weak and trembling, her feet, cut and bruised, protested as they met the hot, gravelly earth. The town was her only option. She began to walk, a slow, painful pilgrimage toward the heat-shimmering buildings. Her dress, once a symbol of purity and wealth, was now a tattered, filth-stained rag that barely clung to her frame. The town had a name, painted on a warped sign at the edge of the single, Dusty Street, Cold Ridge. The name was a cruel joke. The place was an anvil, and the sun was the hammer. Buildings of unpainted, sun-bleached wood listed to one side, their windows like vacant eyes. A dry wind scuttled dust devils down the main thoroughfare. There was no law here, she could feel it. There was only the harsh, unforgiving sun and the silence of a place that kept its secrets. She was disoriented, dizzy from hunger and heat. Faces appeared in dusty windows, watching her pass. Hard-faced women, gaunt men, they stared at the strange apparition. The barefoot woman in the ruined finery, with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She was a bird with broken wings, fallen into a den of wolves. Her feet were bleeding now, but she kept walking, drawn by the one sound of life in the dead town, the tinny, out-of-tune notes of a player piano. The sound came from a large building with swinging doors and a sign that read, "The Gilded Cage Saloon." It was the last place on earth a woman like her should go, which was exactly why she went. She needed water. She needed to sit down before she fell. She pushed through the doors and the world went dim. The air was thick with the smells of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and cheap perfume. After the blinding sun, the gloom was a relief. The piano played onto an audience of a dozen or so men scattered at rough-hewn tables. They were miners, mostly, their faces grimed with dirt, and a few drifters with the watchful, haunted eyes of men who live by their wits. Every head turned. The low murmur of conversation died. All eyes fixed on her. They saw the torn dress, the matted hair, the dirt on her face, but they also saw the fine bones, the delicate line of her jaw, the ghost of wealth and breeding that clung to her like a scent. In a shadowed corner, away from the others, a man sat alone. He wasn't watching her with the same slack-jawed hunger as the rest. His gaze was different, quiet, intense, unreadable. He was lean, dressed in dusty jeans and a plain, dark shirt. His hair was the color of coal, and it fell across a brow that was set in a permanent, brooding line. His face was all angles, his mouth a straight, unsmiling slash. One hand rested on the table beside a half-empty glass of whiskey, and she saw that his knuckles were bruised and split, the skin raw. He looked like he'd been in a fight, and he looked like he'd won. Clara took a faltering step toward the bar, her vision starting to swim. The faces of the men blurred into a hostile smudge. The piano music warped into a discordant jangle. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "Water," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Please." The world dissolved into a black, roaring wave. Her knees buckled. She was falling, a long, slow spiral into darkness. But she never hit the floor. Strong arms caught her, stopping her descent with a sudden, jarring halt. She was lifted, held against a chest that was as hard and unyielding as a rock. The last thing she was aware of before the darkness took her completely was the scent of leather, dust, and something else, something clean and wild, like the plains after a storm, and a pair of eyes, dark and deep as a midnight sky, looking down into hers. Jesse McCrae had seen plenty of desperation walk through the doors of the Gilded Cage, but nothing like this. He held the woman in his arms. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of bones and ruined satin. He looked down at her face, now slack in unconsciousness. Even through the grime, he could see she was beautiful, with a fine, aristocratic delicacy that was as out of place here as a songbird in a slaughterhouse. The saloon was buzzing with whispers. "Where'd she come from? Looks like money. Trouble is what she looks like." He ignored them. He ignored the bartender, who was wiping the counter with a nervous energy. Jesse acted. It was the only way he knew. He carried her through the swinging doors, back out into the blinding sun. The townsfolk who had gathered on the boardwalk parted for him, their stares following him as he walked down the dusty street. A clean, rich woman had no place in Coldridge, and a man like Jesse McCrae had no business holding one. He took her to his cabin, a small, solid structure he'd built himself on a rise of land just outside of town. It wasn't much, one room, a stone hearth, a bed, a table, but it was his. He laid her gently on the simple cot, her filthy dress a stark white stain against the gray wool blanket. He fetched a bucket of water from the well and, tearing a strip from a clean flour sack, began to carefully wash the dirt and dried blood from her face and her torn feet. He worked with a quiet, practiced efficiency. He said little. He did not ask questions. He knew what a hunted thing looked like. That night, a storm broke over the plains. Thunder rattled the small cabin, and lightning lit the world in stark, monochrome flashes. Clara woke with a scream caught in her throat, the remnants of a nightmare clinging to her like a fever sweat. Vane's face, the cold church, the long fall into darkness. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs. The cabin was dark, save for the flickering orange glow from the fireplace. A figure was sitting in a simple wooden chair before it, his back to her. It was the man from the saloon. In the shifting firelight, she could see the silhouette of his shoulders, the dark shape of his head. He was holding a long hunting knife, and the sound that had woken her, she realized, was the soft, rhythmic scrape of steel on a wet stone. Shh, shh, shh. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. A strange man, a locked cabin, a knife. But as she watched him, the fear began to recede, replaced by something else. Something she could not name. He was not looking at her. He seemed lost in his own world, his movements steady, patient, hypnotic. There was a deep, brooding stillness about him. The firelight played over the hard lines of his face, casting his eyes in shadow. He was a dangerous man. She knew that as surely as she knew her own name. But his presence, solid and watchful in the stormy darkness, was not a threat. It was a comfort. It felt more real, more honest than anything she had known in the soft, gilded world she had fled. Here, in a dusty cabin with a silent stranger sharpening a knife, she felt, for the first time in a very long time, strangely and inexplicably safe. The first morning in Jesse McCrae's cabin, Clara woke to the smell of wood smoke and the startling realization that she had slept without dreaming. The cot was hard, the blanket coarse, but she had not been chased by Emery Vane through the dark corridors of her mind. She sat up, her body a map of aches and bruises. The ruined wedding dress lay in a heap on the floor, a dead thing. In its place, on a small wooden stool, was a man's homespun shirt and a pair of denim trousers, patched at the knee but clean. There was also a pair of worn leather boots, too big for her, but better than nothing. He was gone. A pot of coffee sat warming by the hearth, and a slab of cornbread was on the table. She ate with a hunger that shamed her, the simple food more satisfying than any of the elaborate meals she had eaten in her father's house. She dressed in the borrowed clothes, rolling the sleeves of the shirt and the legs of the trousers. They were his. They smelled faintly of him, of dust, leather, and the clean scent of the wind. It was a strange and unsettling intimacy. She knew she could not stay. He had offered a bed for the night, not a home. Gratitude was a debt, and she had no currency with which to pay it. She left the cabin and walked back toward the raw, sun-beaten town of Cold Ridge. She had one thing left to her name, a willingness to work. Silas, the owner of the Gilded Cage Saloon, was a man whose face looked like a poorly mapped territory, all deep lines and shadowy hollows. He squinted at her from behind the bar as she walked in, the morning light a harsh interrogator. "I need work," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. He grunted, polishing a glass with a dirty rag. "What can you do?" I can read and write. I can do sums. I can—" She trailed off, realizing how useless her education was in a place like this. "I can learn," she finished, meeting his skeptical gaze. "I will work harder than anyone you have." He looked her over, from her bare feet, now clean but still cut, to the borrowed clothes that swam on her slender frame. He saw the ghost of quality in her, the fine line of her bones. He also saw the desperation. "Floors need scrubbing," he said, his voice flat. "Spit needs mopping, drinks need serving. It ain't clean work, and the men, they ain't gentlemen." "I understand," she said. And so, Clara's new life began, on her hands and knees with a bucket of lye soap and a stiff-bristled brush. The wooden floorboards were ingrained with years of spilled whiskey, mud, and blood. The work was brutal. It split the skin on her soft hands and made every muscle in her back scream in protest. But with every board she scrubbed, she felt as if she were scouring away a layer of her old life, erasing the helpless girl in the satin dress. The other girls who worked the saloon, Maeve and Lily, watched her with a mixture of suspicion and grudging curiosity. Maeve was the older one, her face hard-bitten and her eyes cynical. Lily was younger, with a prettiness that was already starting to fray at the edges. "You ain't from around here," Maeve stated one afternoon, not a question but a judgment, as she watched Clara haul a heavy bucket of water. "No," Clara said simply. "Best be careful," Maeve continued, lighting a thin cigarillo. "A face like yours draws the wrong kind of attention in a place like this." Clara learned to navigate this new world. She learned to carry a tray of whiskey glasses through a crowd of loud, grasping men. She learned to ignore the crude remarks and to meet a challenging stare with a coldness that promised nothing. She was a ghost behind the bar, a silent worker in the corner. She earned a few coins a day, enough for a room at the back of the saloon and a simple meal. She was surviving. But she never saw Jesse McCrae. He did not come into the gilded cage. Not during the day. Not at night. She would find herself scanning the swinging doors, a knot of disappointment tightening in her stomach each time they admitted some other dusty stranger. It was foolish. The man had saved her from collapsing, had given her shelter for a night. He owed her nothing more. Yet his absence felt like a deliberate act, a void in the chaos of the saloon. One evening, as she was wiping down tables, she dared to ask Silas. "The man who brought me here," she began, her voice low. "Mr. McCrae, does he not come in here?" Silas stopped polishing his glasses. His eyes flickered toward the back corner of the room, the same shadowed spot where Jesse had been sitting that first day. "McCrae don't drink here no more. Has his reasons." The reasons came to her later, in whispers from Lily during a quiet hour before the evening rush. They sat on the back steps, the air cooling as the sun bled out behind the hills. "It was 2 years back," Lily said, her voice barely a murmur. "Right there, at that table," she pointed a slim finger. "A card game with a man named Tolliver. Tolliver was a cheat and a bully. He accused Jesse's younger brother, Caleb, of marking the deck. It wasn't true. Everyone knew Tolliver was just mean. But he pushed Caleb. Caleb pushed back, and Tolliver drew on him." Lily hugged her knees, her eyes distant. "Jesse was faster. He shot Tolliver dead before the man's gun even cleared his holster. The sheriff called it a fair fight. Self-defense. But Tolliver had kin. Powerful men from the next county. They spread stories. Said Jesse was the instigator. That he and his brother were thieves. It got ugly. There was a range war. Cattle stolen, fences cut. In the end, Caleb ended up dead. Shot in the back by a sheriff's deputy who claimed he was resisting arrest." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Jesse's name was ruined," Lily finished softly. "The charges never stuck. But the talk did. People say he's cursed. That trouble follows him and anyone he gets close to. He hasn't set foot in here for a drink since the night Tolliver died." "Cursed," the word echoed in Clara's mind. She, too, was cursed. The runaway bride, The woman who had brought shame on her family, who had traded a life of privilege for scrubbing floors. She understood, in a way she could not articulate, the heavy cloak of a reputation you did not earn but could not shed. The knowledge made Jesse's absence feel less like an abandonment and more like a wound he could not bear to touch. A week later, the past came for her. It arrived in the saddlebag of a freight driver, a folded piece of paper he tacked to the wall beside notices for livestock auctions and wanted criminals. It was a bounty poster. The drawing was a good likeness, capturing the girl she had been, her hair neatly coiled, her expression placid. Below the image, the words were stark and brutal. Wanted. Information leading to the safe return of Clara May Stanhope, who fled her home in Denver. She is believed to be in a state of confusion and distress. $500 reward, offered by her loving fiancé, Emery Vane. Clara stood frozen before it, the noise of the saloon fading to a dull roar in her ears. $500. It was more money than most men in Cold Ridge would see in 2 years. It was enough to turn a neighbor into a betrayer, a friend into a hunter, and the words, loving fiancé and safe return, were the cruelest cut of all. It was not a rescue mission. It was a retrieval. She was not a lost person. She was lost property. The saloon grew quiet. She could feel the eyes on her back. The whispers started. No longer curious, but sharp with calculation. She was no longer just the mysterious woman who scrubbed floors. She was a prize. That evening, Silas cornered her by the storeroom. His face was grim. "You saw the poster," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's a dangerous amount of money. Girl, there are men in this town who would sell their own mother for 1/10 of that. They'll be watching you, every move." "What should I do?" she whispered, her hands trembling. "Run," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Tonight, take what you've earned and disappear before some bounty hunter with more greed than sense decides to collect." But where could she run to? The vast, empty plains that had seemed like freedom now felt like a trap. Vane's reach was as long as his railroad tracks. There was no place far enough. She fled the saloon, needing air, needing to escape the suffocating weight of 100 hungry eyes. She ended up behind the stables, the familiar, earthy smell of hay and horses a small comfort. The dam of her composure finally broke. She sank to the ground, her back against the rough wood of the corral, and wept. She cried for the girl she had been, for the woman she was becoming, and for the terrifying uncertainty of the future. The tears were hot, silent, and bitter. A shadow fell over her. She looked up, startled, wiping her eyes with the back of her raw hand. It was Jesse. He stood a few feet away, his face cast in the deep shadows of the twilight. He didn't speak, just watched her, his expression as unreadable as ever. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice thick with tears. He took a step closer, his worn boots silent in the thick dust. He gestured vaguely toward the town. "I saw the poster." Of course he had. Everyone had. The words spilled out of her then, a torrent of fear and fury that she could no longer contain. "He'll never stop," she sobbed, the story tumbling out in a broken, desperate rush. The arranged marriage to a man 3 times her age, the coldness of her father, trading her like livestock, the suffocating weight of Vane's possession, the escape, the train, the terror. She told him everything. He listened without interruption, his dark eyes never leaving her face. His silence was not empty. It was a vessel, holding the full weight of her confession. When she was finished, her voice a raw whisper, she waited for him to speak, to offer some word of advice or pity. He offered neither. He just stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Then he spoke, his voice a low, rough rasp. "You don't belong here." The words hit her like a slap. He was telling her to leave, just like Silas had. He was casting her out. A fresh wave of despair washed over her. But then she saw it. In the fading light, She saw the muscle ticking in his jaw, the tightness around his mouth, and when he spoke, his voice had cracked, a barely perceptible tremor on the last word. He was not pushing her away out of disdain. He was pushing her away out of something that looked dangerously like fear. Not for himself, for her. He turned then and walked away, disappearing into the deepening shadows without another word, leaving her alone with the cold truth of his warning. Later that night, the gilded cage was a tinderbox of tension, a trio of rough miners, drunk on cheap whiskey and the promise of Vane's reward, had been watching her all evening. One of them, a big man with a greasy beard and small, piggish eyes, finally made his move. As Clara passed with a tray of drinks, he grabbed her wrist, his grip like an iron band. $500, he sneered, his breath sour. You're worth a pretty penny, little lady. Maybe we ought to keep you safe for your fiancé. His friends laughed. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but the days of being a helpless victim were over. With her free hand, she brought the heavy tray down hard on his head. Bottles shattered, whiskey sprayed, and the man roared in pain, his grip slackening for an instant. It was enough. She wrenched her arm free and shoved him backward. He stumbled, crashing into a table and sending cards and poker chips flying. The saloon erupted. The man lunged for her, his face contorted with rage. Silas shouted from behind the bar, but before the miner could reach her, another man stepped in his way, and a fist flew, and suddenly the whole room was a whirlwind of swinging punches and crashing furniture. Clara scrambled out of the fray, her hand bleeding from a shard of broken glass. She ran to the water trough behind the saloon, her whole body shaking. The brawl was a distant roar. Under the cold, indifferent light of the moon, she plunged her hand into the icy water, gasping as it stung the open cut. She watched, mesmerized, as a ribbon of her own blood swirled away into the darkness of the trough. She was not aware of him until she saw his reflection in the water. Jesse was standing in the shadows of the livery stable across the way, a dark, silent sentinel. He had been there the whole time, watching. A surge of anger, sharp and hot, coursed through her. Why hadn't he helped? She lifted her head, her dripping hand clenched into a fist, and their eyes met across the dusty space. The look that passed between them was no longer one of quiet understanding or wary assessment. It was something else entirely. It was raw, stripped bare of all pretense. He saw the fight in her, the blood on her hands, the fierce, untamed thing she was becoming. And she saw in his shadowed gaze a reflection of her own desperation, a shared loneliness, and a hunger that was as sharp and dangerous as a shard of glass. He moved then. He crossed the distance in a few long, silent strides. He didn't stop until he was standing right in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He said nothing. He simply lifted his hand, his calloused fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, yet it sent a jolt through her that was more powerful than any blow. He lowered his head, and his mouth found hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was sudden, hard, and desperate. He pressed her back against the rough, splintered wall of the saloon, his body caging hers. It was a kiss of anger and fear and a terrible, aching need. It was the collision of two people who had been hunted and haunted, who had nothing left to lose. It was a moment stolen from the jaws of a world that wanted to tear them apart. A low moan escaped her throat, a sound of both surrender and protest. Her hands came up to his chest, meaning to push him away, but instead they curled into the rough fabric of his shirt, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. "I'll burn for this," she whispered against his lips, the words a trembling confession. He didn't stop. He only deepened the kiss, a raw, unspoken answer that said he would burn with her. The moment was shattered by the sharp crack of a gunshot. It was followed by a drunken, triumphant shout from the front of the saloon. I found her. The $500 bride is mine." They pulled apart, their breath ragged. The world came rushing back in, cold and lethal. Another shot splintered the wood of the saloon door. A bounty hunter, drunk, armed, and ready to claim his prize. Clara's blood ran cold, but Jesse was already moving. He pushed her behind him, his body a shield, in a single fluid motion that was terrifyingly fast. He drew the Colt revolver from the holster on his hip. He drew first. He always did. The bounty hunter's boast died in his throat, replaced by a wet, choking sound. He staggered back a step, his eyes wide with a drunkard's stupid surprise. A dark flower bloomed on the center of his chest. He looked down at it, then back up at Jesse, as if to ask a question he would never get to speak. Then his legs gave out, and he collapsed into the dust of Cold Ridge's main street, a discarded puppet with its strings cut. The silence that followed the gunshot was absolute. It was deeper and heavier than the quiet of the plains at midnight. For a full 10 seconds, the world held its breath. Then, the swinging doors of the gilded cage flew open, and men spilled out onto the boardwalk, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and fear. Jesse did not lower his gun. He stood over the body, the barrel of his Colt still smoking, his face a mask of cold granite. Clara was behind him, her hands pressed to her mouth, the sharp, acrid smell of gunpowder filling her senses. She had seen death before, in the sanitized, quiet sick rooms of Denver. She had never seen it delivered so swiftly, so brutally. A man in a slightly too clean suit with a tin star pinned to his chest pushed through the crowd. Sheriff Brody, his eyes, small and shifty, took in the scene, the dead man, the smoking gun in Jesse's hand, and Clara, the $500 prize, standing in the shadows. "McCrae," the sheriff said, his voice trying for authority but landing on Reedy. "What's the meaning of this?" "He drew on me," Jesse said, his voice a low rumble. He finally lowered his pistol, but he did not holster it. "This man," Brody said, nudging the body with the toe of his boot, "was acting as an agent of the law, recovering stolen property." "She ain't property," Jesse growled. "And he was a drunk with a gun, shouting about a reward. He fired first." It was a lie, but a necessary one. The first shot had been the bounty hunter's, but it had gone wide. A wild bullet fired in drunken excitement. Jesse's shot had been the response, immediate and final. Sheriff Brody's gaze shifted to Clara. It was a slimy, assessing look, the look of a man counting coins. "This woman is a runaway, wanted by her legal guardian, Mr. Emery Vane, a very important man. He wants her back, safe and sound." "Then he should have sent someone sober," Jesse said. He took a half step back, positioning himself more fully in front of Clara. It was a clear, unmistakable gesture. She was with him. The sheriff's face hardened. He knew he had no legal ground to stand on, not with a dozen witnesses who had heard the bounty hunter's drunken threats. But the challenge had been made. "This ain't over, McCrae," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You've made a powerful enemy tonight, both of you." He turned and ordered 2 men to drag the body away. The crowd slowly dispersed, their whispers following Jesse and Clara like a cloud of flies. They were alone again in the dusty street, the blood stain on the ground already turning black under the moonlight. Back in the cabin, the silence was a living thing, thick with unspoken words. The adrenaline had drained away, leaving behind a cold, heavy dread. A man was dead, and it was her fault. If she had never come to Cold Ridge, that bounty hunter would still be alive, drinking his life away in some saloon. Jesse would not have the sheriff and Emery Vane's vengeance hanging over his head. She was a poison, a walking plague of trouble. She had to leave, for his sake. "I have to go," she said, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. She stood by the door, her hand resting on the wooden latch. Jesse was cleaning his revolver at the table. his movements precise and methodical. He didn't look up. "Where would you go?" "It does not matter. Away from here." He was right. "The sheriff. I've made an enemy of you. If I stay, Vane will send more men. They will not all be drunkards." "He'll send them anyway," Jesse said, his voice flat. "They know you're here now. They know you're with me." "Then I will not be with you," she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "I will go tonight. They will follow me, and you will be safe." He finally stopped his work, setting a cylinder gently on the oilcloth. He looked at her, and his eyes were dark with a pain that went far beyond the night's events. "You think the law will protect me if you're gone?" He gave a short, bitter laugh. "You think Sheriff Brody cares about what's right?" He stood up and walked to the hearth, staring down into the flames. "I had a brother, Caleb. He was younger than me, full of life. He never hurt a soul, but we got crossways with a man who had money and influence. A man a lot like your Emery Vane. He wanted our land, so he paid a few men to steal some of his own cattle and drive them onto our property. Then he got the law involved." His voice was low, haunted. "I told Caleb to trust the process. I told him the truth would come out. I told him to go with the deputies peacefully when they came for him. I trusted the law to be fair." He turned from the fire, his face a mask of anguish. "They shot him in the back not a mile from here. Said he was trying to escape. Brody was a deputy then. He was there. He watched it happen." He took a step toward her, his fists clenched at his sides. "I will not make that mistake again," he said, his voice a raw whisper of fury and regret. "I will not stand by and let a man with a badge and a rich man's money destroy someone else. Someone else." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Clara understood. This was not just about her. It was about his brother. It was about the ghosts that haunted this cabin, this land, this man. To let her go would be to let Caleb die all over again. The space between them crackled with a tension that was more than just fear. It was a recognition of shared wounds, of being hunted by forces bigger than themselves. She saw past the hard, silent cowboy to the grieving brother, the man betrayed by the very world he was meant to trust. She moved toward him, her hand leaving the safety of the door latch. She stopped just before him, her heart aching for the pain in his eyes. Without a word, she reached up and laid her palm against his rough, unshaven cheek. He flinched, as if unused to a gentle touch, but he did not pull away. He closed his eyes and leaned into her hand, a shudder running through his powerful frame. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke. A low rumble of thunder shook the cabin, and a sudden flash of lightning illuminated them in a stark, blue-white light. In that instant, she saw the raw vulnerability on his face. He was not just a killer, a survivor. He was a man drowning in a past he could not escape, and she was drowning with him. He opened his eyes, and the question in them was one she knew how to answer. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs stroking the line of her jaw. He lowered his head and kissed her. This kiss was nothing like the desperate, angry one against the saloon wall. It was slow, searching, full of a terrible, aching tenderness. It was a question and an answer, a prayer and a confession. He broke the kiss and lifted her into his arms, carrying her the few steps to the simple cot. He laid her down gently, his eyes never leaving hers. Outside, the rain began to fall, a gentle tapping that grew into a furious roar, drumming against the roof and walls, isolating them from the world. Lightning flashed again and again, each brilliant pulse a snapshot of their joining, his calloused hands on her soft skin. The dark silk of her hair spread across the gray blanket, the flicker of firelight on their bare shoulders. Their passion was a storm of its own, raw and elemental. It was a desperate clinging, a search for solace in a world that offered none. It was a language of scars, of pain, of a profound and shattering loneliness that could only be eased by the touch of another lost soul. For one night, in the heart of a raging storm, They were not the hunted. They were just a man and a woman, finding a fragile shelter in each other. The morning broke gray and weeping. A fine, persistent drizzle had replaced the storm, turning the world outside to a palette of mud and mist. A fragile peace had settled in the small cabin, but they both knew it was borrowed time. "I need to go into town," Clara said softly. The fight at the saloon had torn her borrowed shirt, and she needed thread. More than that, she needed to see if any new posters had arrived, to gauge the mood of the town. It was a foolish risk, but hiding felt like a slower kind of death. "No," Jesse said immediately. "It's not safe. Brody will be watching." "I will be careful," she promised. "In and out. No one will even see me." He argued, but she was resolute. She could not live her life cowering in this cabin, waiting for the end to come. He finally relented, his face set in grim lines. He watched her from the doorway as she walked down the muddy track toward Cold Ridge, a ghost in the morning mist. She made it to the general store without incident, her head down, her movements quick. She bought her thread and was about to leave when she saw him. Sheriff Brody, standing on the boardwalk across the street, watching the store. He hadn't seen her yet. Her heart leaped into her throat. She ducked back from the window, her mind racing. She slipped out the back entrance of the store, into a narrow, muddy alley. She thought she was clear, but as she rounded the corner, a figure stepped out from behind a rain barrel, blocking her path. It was Maeve, the saloon girl, her face pale. "He knows you're here," Maeve whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Someone told him." Before the Clara could react, Sheriff Brody appeared at the end of the alley. He was not alone. 2 deputies, big, lumbering men, flanked him. "Clara May Stanhope," Brody declared, his voice booming with false authority. "You are under arrest, for your own protection, of course. We cannot have a distressed woman of your quality wandering about in such a dangerous town." "I am not distressed," Clara said, her voice shaking but firm. "And I do not need your protection." "That is for Mr. Vane to decide," Brody sneered. He nodded to his men. "Take her." She struggled as they grabbed her arms, her feet slipping in the mud. They were dragging her back toward the main street when a voice, cold as a razor, cut through the damp air. "Let her go. Brody!" "Jesse!" He stood at the opposite end of the alley, 20 yards away. He hadn't gone back to the cabin. He had followed her. He was soaked to the bone, mud splattered up to his knees, but he stood as still as a statue. His right hand hovered over the butt of his Colt. "Now, McCrae, don't be foolish," the sheriff blustered, his hand moving uncertainly toward his own pistol. "This is official business." "I said," Jesse repeated, his voice dropping even lower, "let her go." The world seemed to slow down. The drizzle, the smell of wet earth, the tension that was a physical thing in the narrow alley. Brody's deputies looked at their boss, then at Jesse, and their confidence wavered. They had all heard what happened to the last man who faced Jesse McCrae. Brody made his decision. "She's Vane's property! The law's on my side!" he yelled, and drew his gun. It was all the reason Jesse needed. His Colt was in his hand in a blur of motion. He didn't fire at the sheriff. He fired at the ground, a single shot that sent mud and gravel spraying into the deputies' faces. They flinched, momentarily blinded. In that instant, Jesse lunged forward, grabbing Clara's arm and pulling her with him. They scrambled over a pile of crates at the side of the alley and ran. They fled into the wilderness, into the vast, unforgiving plains that surrounded the town. The drizzle turned back into a driving rain, cold and relentless. There was no time to get horses, no time for a plan. There was only the desperate, pounding rhythm of their feet sinking in the mud, the ragged sound of their breathing, and the shouts of the sheriff's posse fading behind them. They ran for miles, until their lungs burned and their legs were numb with exhaustion. The rain washed away their tracks, but also stole their strength, chilling them to the bone. Finally, as dusk began to bleed into the gray, rain-soaked sky, they stumbled upon it, the skeletal remains of a burned-out barn, its charred timbers like the ribs of a great, fallen beast. It was not much, but it was shelter. They collapsed inside onto a pile of damp, rotting hay, the wind whistling through the gaps in the scorched walls. The adrenaline was gone, and in its place was a bone-deep weariness and a crushing despair. Clara broke. The last of her strength, the last of her hope, gave way. Sobs racked her body, harsh and ragged. "I cannot do this anymore," she gasped, the words torn from her. "I am so tired of running. I am so tired of being hunted, so tired of hiding in the dark. I just want it to stop." Jesse pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her trembling body, offering what little warmth he had left. He held her, letting her cry, his own face a grim mask of exhaustion and pain. When her sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, he began to speak, his voice a low murmur against her hair. He told her the rest of the story, the parts Lily hadn't known, the parts he had never told another living soul. He told her how the cattle rustling charge was a lie designed to break his family. He told her about the night the deputies came, not with warrants, but with rifles. "They didn't come to arrest him," Jesse said, his voice thick with a grief that was still raw. "They came to kill him. I saw it in their eyes. But I was young. I still believed in a piece of paper, in a badge. I let him go." He choked on the words. "I can still see it in my dreams. His face when he looked back at me. He was so scared. And I just stood there. I just stood there and watched them lead him away." He fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging in the damp, cold air. Clara pulled back and looked at him. In the dim light, she could see the sheen of unshed tears in his eyes. His story was her story. His pain was her pain. Both of them had been betrayed by a world that was supposed to protect them. Both of them were hunted by men who used the law as a weapon. They were stripped of everything now. They had no home, no safety, no future. All they had was the warmth of each other's bodies and the terrible, beautiful truth of their shared experience. In the ruins of a burned-out barn, surrounded by a world that wanted them dead, they found a strange and profound moment of peace. He brushed the wet hair from her face, his touch infinitely gentle. She looked into his eyes, and she saw her own reflection there. Not a frightened runaway, but a survivor, a fighter. She had made her choice the night before, in the warmth of his bed. Now, in the cold and the dark, she sealed it. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. "I will never leave you," she promised, her voice a fierce whisper in the darkness. She pulled back, her eyes holding his, her resolve as hard as steel. "Even if we burn." The arrival of Emery Vane in Cold Ridge was not like the arrival of other men. He did not ride in on a dusty horse, weary from the trail. He arrived in a single, gleaming black rail car, a private kingdom of polished brass and dark mahogany. Attached to the end of the morning freight train, it was an alien vessel, a piece of Denver's power and industry deposited in the heart of the raw, sun-cracked wilderness. He stepped from the car onto a specially placed stool, a man untouched by the dust that coated everything and everyone else in the town. He was dressed in a tailored black suit, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He was not a large man, but he radiated an aura of immense, unyielding power. With him were 4 other men, quiet and watchful, with cold eyes and the kind of suits that did not belong in the West. Pinkerton agents, hired guns who carried the authority of Vane's checkbook. The town watched from a distance, a new kind of fear, colder and more calculating than the fear of a common outlaw, settled over Cold Ridge. This was not about a gunfight. This was about money, and the kind of power that could buy the law, buy men, and buy silence. Vane did not bother with pleasantries. He strode directly to the sheriff's office, his agents fanning out behind him. The meeting was short. When Sheriff Brody emerged, his face was pale. but his eyes held the zealous gleam of a man who had been given a purpose and a significant reward. That afternoon, a posse was formed. Brody stood on the steps of the gilded cage, a heavy leather bag in his hand. "Mr. Emery Vane is offering a generous reward," he announced to the assembled crowd of miners and drifters. $50 a day, plus a bonus, for every man who rides with me to bring in the fugitive Jesse McCrae and recover the lost woman, Clara Stanhope. He opened the bag and let a stream of silver coins pour into his palm. The sound, a crisp, metallic cascade, was mesmerizing. It was the sound of temptation, the sound of loyalty being bought and sold. Men who had nodded respectfully to Jesse a week before now looked at each other with greedy, calculating eyes. $50 a day was a fortune. The town was torn. In the quiet corners of the general store and over the washtubs behind the boarding house, women whispered their sympathies for the runaway bride. They had seen the haunted look in her eyes, the fierce pride that had not been broken by scrubbing floors. The men were more pragmatic. They knew Jesse McCrae was fast with a gun and slow to anger, a man who kept to himself, but they also knew the reality of an empty stomach and the power of a silver dollar. Fear was a more persuasive argument than sympathy. Most stayed silent, their eyes downcast, not wanting to choose a side in a war they knew they could not win. Clara and Jesse, hidden in the skeleton of the burned-out barn, knew nothing of this. They knew only the gnawing hunger in their bellies and the constant, chilling dampness that had settled deep in their bones. Jesse had managed to snare a rabbit, and they cooked it over a small, smokeless fire, the meat tough but life-sustaining. For 2 days, they were ghosts, living in the ruins, their world shrunk to the fragile circle of their firelight. The betrayal came from the smallest of hands, a 10-year-old boy named Timmy, out checking his father's trap lines, saw the flicker of their fire. He had seen the beautiful, sad woman in town, had seen the dark, quiet man who sometimes passed his family's small homestead with a silent nod. He knew they were hiding. He also knew his mother was sick, her cough growing worse with each passing week, and that the traveling doctor's medicine cost $2 silver, a sum as unattainable as the moon. The boy wrestled with his conscience for a full day, but the sound of his mother's labored breathing in the night was a more powerful argument than the memory of a kind face. He walked the 5 miles into town and found Sheriff Brody. The coin the sheriff pressed into his small, dirty palm was cold and heavy. It felt like a stone. The ambush was swift and merciless. Clara and Jesse were huddled by the fire, sharing the last of the rabbit, when a voice cut through the gray afternoon. "It's over. McCrae, drop the gun." Sheriff Brody stood at the wide, gaping entrance of the barn, flanked by a dozen men with rifles leveled at them. They had surrounded the place, silent as wolves. Jesse was on his feet in an instant, pushing Clara behind him, his own Colt seeming to leap into his hand, but he was hopelessly outnumbered. A dozen rifles against 1 pistol. "Don't be a fool," Brody said, a smug smile on his face. "There's no way out." Jesse knew it was true, but he would not be taken like his brother. He would not surrender. He shifted his weight, preparing to make a last, desperate stand. And in that moment of calculation, a shot rang out, not from the front, but from the side. One of Vane's Pinkertons, positioned in the loft above them, had taken the killing shot. The bullet slammed into Jesse's left shoulder, spinning him around. A cry of agony was torn from his throat. He staggered, his gun falling from his numb fingers, and collapsed to the ground. "No!" Clara's scream was a raw, animal sound of pure terror. She threw herself toward him, but rough hands grabbed her, dragging her back. She fought with the ferocity of a cornered wildcat, kicking and scratching, her nails tearing at the arms that held her. "Jesse!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "Jesse!" They dragged her away, out of the barn and into the cold, unforgiving light. The last thing she saw was Jesse's still form lying in the dirt, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder. His eyes closed. Then they threw a rough burlap sack over her head, and her world went black. Jessie was not dead. The Pinkertons' aim had been slightly off. The bullet had torn through muscle and glanced off the bone. A wound that was agonizing and debilitating, but not immediately fatal. He lay in a spreading pool of his own blood, drifting in and out of consciousness, the sound of Clara's screams echoing in his fading mind. After the posse had gone, taking Clara with them, a new kind of silence fell over the barn. A silence of death and defeat. He might have died there, bleeding out into the cold earth, but help came from the most unlikely of places. Maeve and Lily, from the saloon, had heard the talk. They had seen the posse ride out. Maeve, for all her hard cynicism, had a core of decency that Vane's money could not buy. She had followed them at a distance, and when she saw them drag Clara away, leaving Jessie for dead, she acted. She and Lily brought a rickety buckboard, and with strength born of desperation, they loaded Jessie's unconscious body into the back, covering him with old horse blankets. They hid him in the saloon storeroom, a small, windowless space that smelled of whiskey and sawdust. A traveling doctor, a man named Elias, happened to be in town, a quiet, scholarly man who asked few questions and had a deft hand with a needle. Maeve paid him with her own meager saving. "He's lost a lot of blood," the doctor said grimly, after he had probed the wound, removed the bullet, and stitched the ragged flesh back together. "The next 24 hours will tell the tale. He'll have a fever. If it breaks, he might live. If not..." He did not need to finish. The saloon girls took turns tending to him, risking their own safety with every bowl of cool water they brought, with every whispered word of encouragement. They were terrified. If Brody or Vane's men found him, they would all be arrested, or worse. But they did not waver. In the face of Vane's cold, calculated tyranny, they had chosen their side. Clara was thrown into the town jail, a single filthy cell with a dirt floor and one barred window. Her fine dress was torn and covered in mud and Jessie's blood. The burlap sack was ripped from her head, and she blinked in the dim, foul-smelling light. A few hours later, the cell door creaked open. Emery Vane stood there, framed by the doorway, looking as immaculate as he had the day he stepped off the train. He looked at her disheveled state, at the dirt on her face, and his lips curled into a thin, triumphant smile. "Well, my dear," he said, his voice a low, condescending purr, "it seems your little adventure has come to its inevitable conclusion. I hope you found it fulfilling." She said nothing, only glared at him with a hatred so pure it was a physical force. He entered the cell, moving with a predator's grace. "I am a reasonable man. Clara, I am willing to forgive this temporary delusion, this lapse in judgment." He trailed a finger along one of the iron bars, his touch leaving a clean streak in the grime. "Here is my offer. You will be cleaned up. You will put on a proper dress, and you will stand before the good people of this town and you will apologize. You will tell them you were confused, that this outlaw McCrae took advantage of you, and then you and I will be married. Immediately. Here. We will put this unpleasantness behind us and return to Denver as man and wife." He was not just offering marriage. He was offering humiliation. He wanted to break her, to parade his victory in front of the very people who had witnessed her defiance. He wanted to erase the woman she had become and reclaim the property he had lost. She stared at him, her breathing slow and steady. She saw the years stretching out before her, a lifetime in his cold, suffocating grip. She thought of Jessie, lying bleeding in the dirt, and a white-hot rage burned away her fear. She took a step forward, and with all the force she could muster, she spat in his face. Vane recoiled, his face a mask of stunned fury. He wiped the spittle from his cheek with a silk handkerchief, his eyes turning to chips of ice. "I would rather burn," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. His composure cracked. He slapped her, A vicious, open-handed blow that snapped her head to the side and sent her staggering against the wall. The taste of blood filled her mouth. "So be it," he said, his voice a frigid whisper. "You will have your wedding, but you will not have a choice." That night, the town was ordered to gather at the small, clapboard church. It was not a celebration. It was a summons. Vane's Pinkertons stood guard at the doors, their faces grim. The townsfolk filed in, their faces somber, their movements slow. They were attendees at a funeral, not a wedding. Maeve and Lily were forced to prepare her. They brought a basin of water and a simple white dress, not the satin and lace of her first wedding, but a plain cotton garment that felt like a burial shroud. They washed the blood and dirt from her face, their hands gentle, their eyes full of a helpless pity. They could see the dark, ugly bruise blooming on her cheek, the split in her lip. They pinned a simple veil to her hair. It did little to hide the defiant fire that burned in her eyes. She was a bride being led to the gallows. She walked down the aisle on Sheriff Brody's arm, her steps steady, her head held high. She saw the faces in the pews, the downcast eyes of the men who had ridden in the posse, the tear-streaked faces of the women. Vane stood at the altar, his face a mask of cold triumph, a preacher beside him looking pale and terrified. The scene was a grotesque parody of the one she had fled in Denver. She was trapped, with no escape. This time, there was no back door, no freight train to carry her away. But as she reached the altar and Brody handed her over to Vane's claw-like grip, her eyes swept the back of the small church. For a moment, she thought she saw a shadow detach itself from the deeper darkness near the door, a flicker of movement where none should be. It was Jesse. He was pale as a ghost, his left arm in a crude sling, his shirt stained with blood. He was leaning heavily against the back wall for support, but he was there, and in his right hand, held low so no one could see it yet, was his Colt. He was weak, he was wounded, but he was there, and he had come to burn it all down. The preacher, a nervous man with a perpetually sweating brow, cleared his throat and raised his voice to be heard over the oppressive silence in the church. If any man can show just cause, why they may not be lawfully joined together. Let him now speak. A voice from the back of the church cut through his words, weak but carrying the cold, clear authority of a death sentence. I've got something to say. Every head in the church turned as one. Emery Vane's face, a moment before flushed with triumph, turned the color of ash. He spun around, his grip on Clara's arm tightening like a vice. There, leaning against the great oak doors, was the ghost they had all left for dead. Jesse McCrae was a specter of vengeance, his face ashen, his clothes stained with mud and blood. His left arm was bound tightly to his chest in a crude sling, but his right hand was steady, and in it, he held his Colt revolver. "McCrae," Sheriff Brody stammered, his hand hovering over his own gun. "You're under arrest." "Are you going to shoot me in the back too, Brody?" Jesse asked, his voice soft, but every man in the room heard it. He took a painful step forward, away from the support of the wall. "Or are you going to let your master's dogs do it for you?" The 4 Pinkerton agents, positioned discreetly among the pews, rose as one. They were professionals, their faces impassive as they drew their weapons. The townspeople screamed, a wave of panic crashing through the holy silence. They scrambled for cover, diving beneath the pews, a terrified flock of sheep caught in a wolf's den. "Kill him!" Vane hissed to his men. The church erupted in a deafening cacophony of gunfire. The first shot came from a Pinkerton near the front, but Jesse was already moving, diving behind the last pew, the wood exploding into splinters where his head had been, the stained glass window depicting a serene, forgiving Christ shattered, raining down a rainbow of deadly shards. Jesse, fueled by a combination of raw fury and the laudanum the doctor had given him, fought with the grim efficiency of a cornered animal. He was wounded, his movements labored, but his aim was true. He fired from behind the cover of the heavy oak pew, the shots from his Colt a deep, booming contrast to the sharper cracks of the agent's pistols. One of the Pinkertons cried out and crumpled to the floor, his shot going wild and tearing a chunk from the pulpit. Clara was thrown to the floor as Vane shoved her aside, using her as a momentary shield before scrambling for the cover of the altar. She landed hard, her head striking the stone floor. For a moment, the world was a blur of smoke, noise, and screaming. Jesse fired again. A second Pinkerton staggered back, clutching his chest, and fell across a terrified parishioner. The remaining two agents exchanged a nervous glance. This was not the easy job they had been paid for. Their employer was a coward, hiding behind the altar, and the man they were fighting was a devil who refused to die. One of them began to fall back, firing wildly toward the rear of the church before bolting through the shattered doors. The other, more resolute, took careful aim at Jesse's position. Jesse knew he was exposed. He rose to switch positions, and the agent's bullet caught him high in the side, a fiery, tearing pain that stole his breath and sent him sprawling into the aisle. His vision swam with black spots. The Colt slipped from his grasp, clattering on the stone floor a few feet away. Through the haze of smoke and pain, he saw the last Pinkerton advancing down the aisle, his pistol leveled, a grim smile of victory on his face. This was it. He had failed. But the killing shot never came. Clara had seen Jesse fall. She had seen the gun slide across the floor. In that instant, something cold and clear burned through her terror. The helpless girl who had run from a wedding in Denver was gone forever, consumed by the fire of the last few weeks. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, her white dress dragging through the dirt and blood. She snatched up the heavy revolver. It felt alien in her hand. A solid, brutal weight. She had never fired a gun in her life. She saw Vane crawling away from the altar like the snake he was, trying to reach a side door. He was abandoning his men, abandoning his fight, concerned only with his own miserable skin. "Vane!" she screamed, her voice a raw, unrecognizable sound. He turned, his face a mask of disbelief. She lifted the heavy gun with both hands, the barrel shaking, and pulled the trigger. The recoil was a physical blow, slamming her back on her heels. The roar of the shot was deafening, but she saw Vane cry out, his leg buckling beneath him as he collapsed, clutching a shattered knee. She had not killed him. She had crippled him. She had stopped him. Her ears ringing. She turned the gun back toward the advancing Pinkerton, but before she could fire again, the agent grunted, a look of surprise on his face, and pitched forward, a bullet hole in his back. High above, in the choir gallery, Silas, the owner of the Gilded Cage, stood wreathed in smoke, a long-barreled shotgun in his hands. He had slipped up there during the initial chaos, his face grim, his mind made up. He had watched the town cower for too long. But the danger was not over. Sheriff Brody, seeing his chance to end it, to clean up the mess for his master, raised his pistol. He did not aim at Silas. He aimed at the wounded, helpless form of Jesse McCrae, lying exposed in the aisle. "Drop it, Silas!" Brody yelled, his voice cracking with fear and greed. "It's over!" He never finished the thought. A shot rang out, not from the gallery, but from the pews. The bartender from the Gilded Cage, a man who had never spoken more than 3 words to Clara, stood up, a small derringer in his hand, his face pale but resolute. Brody gasped, a red stain spreading on his chest, and fell without another sound. That was the spark. Silas's shot had been the turning point, but the bartender's was the signal. A great rising roar of fury came from the pews. The townspeople, who had been beaten down by fear and bought with silver, finally rose up. The miners, the blacksmith, the stable hands. They surged into the aisle. They were not armed with guns, but with a righteous anger that was far more powerful. They surrounded the last fleeing Pinkerton, disarming him with their bare hands. They swarmed toward the altar, where Emery Vane was trying to drag himself away, his face contorted in pain and terror. The tide had not just turned, It had become a tidal wave. The town of Coldridge was taking back its soul. They did not kill Vane. Silas, his shotgun still smoking, took charge. "He'll stand trial," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. "We'll send a telegram to the federal marshal in Denver. We'll tell them everything. About Vane, about Brody, about the whole rotten business." The fight was over. The church fell silent, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and liberation. Clara dropped the gun and scrambled to Jesse's side. The adrenaline that had fueled him had faded, and the cost of his victory was terrifyingly clear. His face was the color of bleached bone, his breathing shallow and ragged. Blood was everywhere, a dark, pulsing river flowing from the new wound in his side, soaking into the rough wood of the floor. She knelt in the spreading pool, cradling his head in her lap. "Jesse," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Jesse, look at me. Don't you leave me. Do you hear me? You cannot leave me now." His eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus on her face. A faint, pained smile touched his lips. "You look beautiful in that dress," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he went limp in her arms. Her white dress, the symbol of her bondage, was soaked crimson with his blood. She held him tight, her tears falling on his still face, and screamed for the doctor. The hours that followed were a waking nightmare. They carried Jesse to the small room the traveling doctor used as an infirmary. Doctor, Elias, his face grim, cut away the blood-soaked shirt. The new bullet was lodged deep in Jesse's side, and the wound in his shoulder had been torn open again. He had lost a terrifying amount of blood. Clara refused to leave. She stood in the corner, her blood-soaked dress clinging to her, and watched as the doctor worked by the light of 2 flickering kerosene lamps. She watched him probe the wound, her own body flinching with every metallic scrape. She watched him fish out the misshapen lump of lead and drop it with a sickening clink into a metal basin. She watched him stitch the torn flesh together, his needle rising and falling, a grim and bloody kind of sewing. "He is strong," the doctor said, his voice low and exhausted as he finally finished, his hands and apron covered in blood. "But I do not know if it will be enough. The blood he has lost, and the fever will come. All we can do now is wait and pray." Clara began her vigil. The town outside was in a state of quiet, determined revolution. Vane and his remaining men were locked in the very jail cell he had put her in. A rider had been dispatched to the nearest telegraph station, carrying a long, detailed message for the authorities in Denver. The black rail car sat on its siding, a silent monument to a fallen tyrant. But Clara saw none of it. Her world had shrunk to the 4 walls of that small room, to the narrow bed where Jesse lay, suspended between life and death. The first night, the fever came. Just as the doctor had predicted, Jesse's body burned with it, his skin hot and dry to the touch. He thrashed in the bed, lost in a delirious world of his own, crying out for his brother, Caleb, his voice hoarse with pain. Clara never left his side. She bathed his face with cool water, her touch gentle, her whispers a constant, soothing murmur. She spoon-fed him broth when he was lucid enough to swallow, holding his head in her steady hands. She read to him from a worn copy of Shakespeare the doctor owned, not knowing if he could hear, but believing the sound of her voice might be a lifeline, an anchor to pull him back from the dark tide that was trying to claim him. Days bled into nights. She dozed in a chair by his bed, her hand never leaving his. She learned the landscape of his unconsciousness, the furrows of pain on his brow, the slight tremor in his hand, the rhythm of his ragged breathing. She watched the slow, agonizing progress of his healing, the way the angry red of his wounds began to soften, the way his fevered flush slowly receded. The town, too, began its own healing. The fear that had been a constant, oppressive weight was gone. People spoke to each other in the street, their voices lighter. Children played in the dust without looking over their shoulders. Silas reopened the saloon, and the sound of the piano, for the first time, sounded not tinny and sad, but hopeful. They were a town without a sheriff, without a master, and for the first time, they were truly free. They were a community forged in the fire of Vane's greed, and they had emerged stronger. On the 5th day, the fever broke. Clara was dozing in her chair, her head resting on the edge of his bed, when she felt a hand, cool and weak, touch her hair. Her eyes flew open. Jesse was awake. His own eyes were clear, the fever gone. He was terribly pale and thin, a shadow of the man he had been. But he was looking at her. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped her. "Hey," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Hey," she whispered back, tears streaming down her face. She leaned forward and kissed his forehead, a soft, reverent touch. "You came back." He closed his eyes, a faint smile on his lips. "Never left," he said, and slipped back into a peaceful, healing sleep. The town had been saved, and now, so had her world. The high, thin air of the plains carried the scent of pine and curing hay, a clean perfume that washed away the lingering stench of gunpowder and fear. 3 weeks had passed since the night the church became a battleground. 3 weeks of quiet healing, not just for the man in the doctor's small room, but for the town of Cold Ridge itself. The sun was a friendly hand on their backs as Clara and Jesse walked the length of the main street. It was the first time he had been strong enough to walk so far, and the town treated the occasion with a quiet, solemn respect. Jesse leaned on her, more than he would ever admit, his left arm still in a sling, his side tightly bound beneath his clean shirt. He moved with a stiff, pained grace, but he moved. He was alive. Everything was different now. The very dust of the street seemed to have settled. The faces that peered from doorways and windows were no longer filled with suspicion or greed, but with something that looked like hope. The blacksmith, a mountain of a man who had once stared through Clara as if she were made of glass, stopped his hammering as they passed, wiped a sweaty hand on his leather apron, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. Jesse nodded back. No words were needed. The owner of the general store, who had sold her thread on that fateful morning, stepped out onto the boardwalk. "Good to see you on your feet, McCrae," he said, his voice genuine. "Ma'am," he added, tipping his hat to Clara. She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "It is a good day, Mr. Henderson." They stopped in front of the gilded cage, the swinging doors, one of which still bore a scar from a stray bullet, were propped open. Maeve and Lily were sweeping the boardwalk. When they saw Clara and Jesse, they dropped their brooms. Maeve, who had always worn her cynicism like a suit of armor, looked at Clara, and her hard face softened, breaking into 1,000 tiny lines. She rushed forward and wrapped Clara in a fierce, tight hug. "We were so worried," she said, her voice thick. "You saved him," Clara whispered back, hugging her just as tightly. "Both of you. I will never forget it." Lily, her eyes shining with unshed tears, hugged Clara next. "You look good," she said. "Happy." Clara looked at Jesse, who stood patiently beside her, his dark eyes watching the exchange. "I am," she said, and the simple truth of the words resonated deep in her soul. They continued their slow walk, heading toward the small cabin on the rise of land outside town. The cabin that had become her home. The weight of what they had been through was a tangible thing between them. A shared history etched in the new lines on their faces and the silver threads of pain in Jesse's scars. His past was a landscape he would carry with him always. The ghost of his brother, Caleb, would never truly be gone. She knew he still woke sometimes in the dead of night, his breath catching on a silent cry, his hand reaching for a gun that was not there. But now, when the nightmares came, he did not face them alone. She would be there, her hand on his chest, her voice a low murmur in the darkness, a steady anchor in the stormy sea of his memory. She would listen when he needed to talk, the words coming out in a slow, painful trickle as he recounted stories of his brother, of their childhood, of the man he had been before the world had tried to break him, and she would sit with him in the comfortable silence when words were not enough. He still bore the weight of his past, but now she helped him carry it. Her love was not a cure, but it was a comfort, a quiet strength that made the burden bearable. Later that week, the stagecoach brought the mail. With it came a letter for her. It was an anomaly in Cold Ridge, a crisp, expensive vellum envelope bearing the seal of a prestigious Denver law firm. It felt like a relic from another lifetime. She took it back to the cabin, her hands trembling slightly as she broke the seal. Jesse watched her from his chair by the hearth, his expression unreadable. The letter was formal, concise, and utterly life-altering. It informed her that, following a federal investigation prompted by the town's telegram, Emery Vane had been formally charged with a litany of crimes: conspiracy, attempted murder, bribery of a public official. His empire was crumbling. The testimony of the people of Cold Ridge, combined with the discovery of his corrupt business practices, had been his undoing. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. The letter went on to state that her father, shamed by the public scandal and facing financial ruin, had fully cooperated with the authorities. Her name was cleared of all wrongdoing. The Stanhope house in Denver, though heavily mortgaged, was hers if she chose to claim it. An account had been set up in her name, a modest sum salvaged from the wreck of her family's fortune. She was free. She could go home. She read the letter twice, the legalistic words blurring before her eyes. Home. The word was a hollow echo. The grand house in Denver, with its silent rooms and suffocating expectations, was not a home. It was the gilded cage she had fled. Her old life, a life of society balls, of arranged dinners, of being a pretty, silent ornament, was being offered back to her on a silver platter. She looked around the small, rough-hewn cabin. She saw the stone hearth Jesse had built with his own hands, the simple wooden table where they shared their meals, the cot where he had fought for his life and where she had discovered the profound, terrifying depth of her own heart. She saw the man sitting in the chair, his body healing, his spirit scarred but unbroken, his dark eyes watching her, waiting. He would not ask her to stay. He would never hold her if she chose to go. He had fought for her freedom, and he would let her use it, even if it took her away from him. She looked back at the letter in her hand, at the neat, soulless script that promised her a world of comfort and emptiness. It was a ghost, a temptation from a life that no longer fit her. She had been forged into someone new in the fires of Cold Ridge, and that person could never go back. Without a word, she walked to the hearth. She knelt before the small, crackling fire and held the letter to the flames. Jesse watched, his expression unchanging, as the corner of the expensive paper blackened, curled, and caught fire. The words of the lawyers, the promises of her old life, turned to gray ash and smoke, disappearing up the chimney into the vast, blue sky. She turned to him, the firelight flickering in her eyes. "I am already home," she said. A slow smile, the first genuine, unguarded smile she had ever seen from him, spread across his face. It transformed him, chasing the shadows from his eyes. He stood, wincing slightly, and came to her. He knelt before her in the warm glow of the fire and drew her into his arms. A few days later, they stood together in the open doorway of the Gilded Cage Saloon. The afternoon sun cast their long shadows across the threshold where she had collapsed. A desperate, broken thing, into his arms. It felt like a lifetime ago. The player piano was tinkling a cheerful, jaunished tune, a sound she no longer found sad, but strangely hopeful. It was the soundtrack of her survival, the theme of her new beginning. "This is where it all started," she said softly, her hand tucked into the crook of his good arm. "It is," he agreed, his voice a low rumble beside her ear. She looked up at him, at the face she now knew better than her own. She saw the fine lines around his eyes, the faint white scar that bisected one eyebrow, the quiet strength in the set of his jaw. He was looking down at her, his dark eyes full of a deep, unspoken emotion. He said nothing. He was not a man of pretty words or grand declarations. His love was in his actions, in the way he had stood between her and a dozen rifles, in the way he had faced down death itself to come back to her. He slowly, deliberately, removed his hat. It was a plain, dusty cowboy hat, its brim softened and shaped by years of sun and rain. It was a part of him, as much as his scarred hands or his quiet nature. He held it out to her, not as a polite gesture, but as an offering. There was no question in his eyes, only a statement. He was offering her everything he was, everything he had, his home, his future, his name, a life in this wild, hard country, by his side, a proposal without a single word. A slow, radiant smile spread across Clara's face. Her heart was so full she thought it might burst. She reached out and took the hat from his hand, her fingers brushing his. She took it, and in doing so, she accepted. She accepted it all. The hardship, the joy, the past that had shaped him, and the future they would build together. He lowered his head and kissed her then. A long, slow kiss in the doorway of the saloon where their two broken worlds had first collided. It was a kiss of promises kept and futures won. A kiss that sealed their bond in the sight of the town they had, in their own way, helped to save. They rode out the next morning. The townspeople came to see them off, pressing small gifts into their hands. A sack of flour, a well-oiled rifle, a thick wool blanket. Maeve and Lily hugged Clara one last time, their eyes bright with tears. They rode side by side, leaving Cold Ridge behind them. Climbing into the low, rolling hills to the west, the air grew cooler, scented with pine. They were heading for a piece of land Jesse owned, a place with a clear running stream and a stand of tall ponderosas, a place where he had always dreamed of building a house. The wind was wild on the high plains, a constant, rushing presence that tore at their clothes and whipped Clara's hair across her face, but they had weathered worse storms. They had faced down death and despair, tyranny and betrayal, and they had won. This wind was just a wild song, a promise of the untamed life they had chosen together. As they reached the crest of a hill, with the whole world spread out before them, vast and beautiful and free, Jesse reined in his horse. Clara stopped beside him. He reached across the space between their saddles and took her hand. She leaned toward him, resting her head against his good shoulder, the rough fabric of his shirt familiar and comforting against her cheek. "I'll burn for this," she whispered again, her voice soft against his neck, the words no longer a moan of fear, but a quiet, fierce declaration of joy. "But I'll burn with you." Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this tale. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from, so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts.